Liz Fleming, you've been a travel journalist for over 15 years. I don't want to date that, but it's over 15 years. Your site, Liz Fleming Travels, inspires readers to find their adventure, which I love. You're also the editor-in-chief of Cruise and Travel Lifestyles magazine, and most recently, you also host a show on iHeartRADIO called Liz Fleming Travels. Liz Fleming, when do you have time to eat?
Well, actually, I forgot to mention, I also edit Bold magazine these days.
When do you have time to eat
So,
and
um,
digest?
um, well, you know, um, working from home means that I don't have to run from meeting to meeting. So I can generally gobble a little something in between meetings, but it's good to be busy. I'd rather be busy than the other way.
Absolutely. Thanks you. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today on the Fact Up podcast, Liz Fleming. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
The whole idea, and we talked about this in the pre, the whole idea of this podcast is to share, connectivity, inspiration, motivation, conversation. And I invited you to be a guest for a reason. I think we share a lot of the same values in uniting people through travel, through experiences. Talk about your positivity project that you started, I would assume, and I would safely guess, closer to the beginning of this pandemic, around March, when everything was kind of falling apart. What's it all about? What inspired the idea? And what's been the reception like on your followers on social media, both on Facebook and on Instagram?
Well, I can actually tell you almost to the minute how long it's been going because I numbered the Positivity Project posts. So I started 164 days ago.
And it's September 16th today? 16th.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've been doing it for a while. And I started it because I wanted to help my friends who were in the travel PR business, because I realized when the pandemic hit and everything was suddenly canceled, that while it was bad for me, it was worse for them. And I thought this would be a way for me to give them a little bit of spotlight, if I could, even if it was only on my Facebook and Instagram feeds. So my thought at the time actually was that I would focus on a different destination and a different kind of trip. And I did that for a little while. And then it started to seem tone deaf because, of course, now we're in a situation where no one can go anywhere. And so I do still give as much spotlight as I can to my friends who promote destinations and hotels and resorts and cruise lines and all that sort of thing. But I've recognized that the lives we're living right now are quite small. And so I've turned my focus closer to home, and I'm trying to celebrate the things that we see and enjoy and can do in our own backyards. And honestly, the reception has been great. I've had lots of people get in touch with me and talk about things that I've posted, which is nice. But the thing that has garnered the most positive reaction has been another project that I'm doing, but I'm showcasing it on my Facebook page. And that is a thing that I call Draw It Forward. And like a lot of people during this pandemic, I've been spending a lot of time at home. And in the evenings, I've been drawing. And I draw people's pets. And it started out as a gift for a friend who got a new puppy. And she said to me, "You should sell this." And I said, "Nah, I don't think I'm good enough to be selling these drawings, but it's fun to do and I'm happy to do it for you." And she said, No, you should sell these." The next day, I bumped into another friend of mine who runs a school breakfast program. And during the pandemic, she's had an incredible surge in requests for support because she's not just feeding the kids who would ordinarily come to school, but now she's feeding their families. Mm-hmm. She needed to raise money. So these two ideas joined in my head, and Draw It Forward was born. So the way it works is this: people send me a photo of their pet, So far, it's only been dogs and cats, but I am open to guinea pigs, hamsters, snakes, fish, whatever you like.
Yeah.
So people send me pictures of their pets. I draw them. And then I send them a high-res version of the drawing that they can print at their own house off their own printer. And they make a donation to Niagara Nutrition Partners.
Wow.
So I've had really good response to that. And I can't give you an exact dollar figure, but we're somewhere over $2,000 now. It always makes me feel better if I think I'm doing something to help. And I love to sit and watch movies with my husband in the evening, but I feel a bit lazy if I'm just sitting there. Right. So I can watch a movie and sketch somebody's pet at the same time. And then if that somebody makes a donation of $50 or $75 or $100 to this charity that I'm working with, everybody's happy.
Well, you've written a couple of ebooks as well, Liz, one of which is entitled 207 Travel Tips Because 101 Wouldn't Have Been Enough. Talk about what your top 5 travel tips are to people specifically who want to be more adventurous, who want to experience more, and they want to kind of enjoy travel more, but maybe overwhelmed by the travel experience in general.
Okay, well, let me see. It was a long time ago I wrote that book. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite tips for people who want to be more adventurous is to not go whole hog.
Okay.
It's if you're not an adventurous traveler by nature or by habit, it's too much to throw yourself into a tent in the woods with a canoe trying to figure out how to light a fire. So I would take it a step at a time. And so a tip that I would offer right now is Parks Canada has some absolutely sensational, authentic camping opportunities. Have you stayed in an authentic?
I haven't, but I've seen photos and I've seen people with the experience, and it looks amazing. Amazing stuff.
Well, what's sensational about them is an authentic is like a cross between a tent and a cabin. Mm-hmm. And so inside you have a wooden floor and you have a table and chairs, you have cooking utensils, you have everything right down to the cutlery to put on the table. There are beds with mattresses. You have to bring a sleeping bag and a pillow. But outside, there's a fire pit. There is a camp stove that you can use also outside. And some of them have wood stoves. Some of them have electric heat. They have electricity. But the walls of the cabin are made of, it's sort of like a rubberized canvas. Mm-hmm. So you have the feeling of sleeping in a tent, but you have the comforts of a cabin. And you don't have to go out into the woods and find your own wood for the fire. They'll have a little wood pile for you. It's the perfect way for someone who's never camped and never been woodsy to give it a try and see what they think.
Right.
So that's what I mean when I say don't go whole hog. Take it a step at a time. You'll be in the woods, but you'll have the convenience of being in a well-equipped cabin. Mm-hmm. So that would be one tip. But some of my other tips, are really simple. Mm-hmm. I'm a big fan of trying to travel with only carry-on luggage if you can. And so one of my best tips is to reduce the size of everything that you pack. So you can buy those special packing bags that you fill with clothing and then you use a vacuum to suck the air out of them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You can do that, but you can also go to the grocery store and buy a package of extra large Ziploc bags mm-hmm. and do pretty much the same thing. Mm-hmm. That will enable you to get, at least I can, get a week's worth of clothing into a carry-on bag. Mm-hmm. That leaves you much more free when you're traveling. You don't have to hang around the luggage carousel waiting for your bag to come off. And you also are able to get yourself through a city without having to necessarily pay for expensive cabs, maybe you'll be able to walk where you want to go.
Yeah. Your other book, Since You're Here, We Might As Well Shag, is full of travel stories from around the world. What can readers expect from that book, and how did you land on that title?
Actually, that's a great story. And the title was the idea of one of my sons. I had written the book and I was trying to decide what to call it. And I sent it to my son and I said, read it and tell me what you think it should be called. And he came back and he said, you've got to call it Since You're Here, We Might As Well Shag.
Okay.
So the story is this. That book is a collection of my favorite travel stories. Some of them were published in the Toronto Star. Some were published in the Canadian press. They came from a variety of my venues. But the story that quote came from is about a guy who went to Myrtle Beach. Mm-hmm. And Myrtle Beach is known for many things, beaches, seafood, but it's also known in the dance and music world as the home of shag dancing.
Okay.
Shag dancing is a kind of dance that became popular in the late 50s and early 60s. And it's kind of a cross between jiving and swing dancing, but the man is definitely the star of the show, and the woman is wrist candy. She sort of just dances around on his wrist.
Okay.
It is still so popular that there are people who come from all over the world twice a year for what they call shag dance safaris. And it's a big dance competition and so on. So if you're going to Myrtle Beach, you'll probably hear about shag dancing, but not everyone knows this. So my story is about a guy who is from England, and I met this guy on a plane, and he went to Myrtle Beach. He was actually a rep for a pharmaceutical company. He was to meet a doctor and take him out for dinner. The doctor turned out to be sick when he arrived, so the doctor, had arranged for his office manager to go out for dinner with this guy. Well, she was a very attractive woman, this woman. Mm-hmm. And so the pharmaceutical rep was quite thrilled. He found her accent was a little weird, and some of the words she used he didn't quite understand, but he certainly thought she was quite lovely.
Right.
So they went out for dinner, and he was hoping for the evening to extend. Mm-hmm. So after dinner, he suggested to her that perhaps they could go back to the bar in his hotel and have a drink. Mm-hmm. And she said, well, I have a better idea. Since you're here, we might as well shag.
Right.
Of course, you know that in England,
yeah,
shagging has nothing to do with dancing.
Well, it's a different type of dancing.
Yes, vertical, right. Yes, horizontal dancing. This guy thought he had died and gone to heaven.
Sure.
Didn't even have to buy her a drink.
Right.
So
right.
That was the intro to a story that I did about shag dancing in Myrtle Beach.
Wow.
And that's why the book is called that.
Well, you're very much involved in cruise travel. Of course, the cruise travel industry, made a bunch of headlines at the start of this pandemic. Several cruise lines, have suspended operations for the next few months in the foreseeable future. What's the latest? You have your ear to the ground. What's the latest with respect to the cruise industry? What steps are the powers that be taking to reestablish faith in people to take cruises? And how do cruise lines market themselves now going forward to give passengers and customers that confidence that it's safe to come back? Loaded question, and it's a three-parter. It's loaded, but do your best. I mean, it's a tricky question.
Those are great questions, actually.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with my comments on how the cruise industry suffered at the beginning of this pandemic. I've been on many, 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 many cruises, and it has always been my observation that a great deal of care goes into sanitizing the ships and making sure that passengers are safe. Long before this pandemic struck, I remember being on a Holland America ship, and for the first 2 days, no passenger was allowed to serve themselves at the buffets. They, on most cruise ships, there's what's called a Lido deck, and that's where the casual dining restaurant is, and it's almost always a giant marché style buffet. And for the first 2 days, no one was allowed to serve themselves, and there were staff all over the place to help you. On every ship I've been on in the last 10 years, probably, there is always a hand sanitization station at the entrance to every dining room and every public space. So it's not that, in my opinion anyway, it's not that the cruise ships were being particularly careless. I don't think they were at all. I think it is simply a matter of having a large number of people in a relatively small, I mean, they're kind of like small cities,
right?
But space where the air circulation is contained in the ship. So that was my opinion on why it was somewhat unfair that cruise ships were being accused of being careless. I don't think they were.
Okay.
So now what's happening? Well, not much. Most cruise lines will not resume sailing until 2021. They are hopeful. They keep sending out messages saying, yes, we're going to be sailing again in September. Oops, update. No, we're going to be sailing again in October. No, actually, it'll be November. My best guess is that most cruise lines won't resume until probably spring of 2020.
2021. 2021.
2021.
Yep.
Yes. So what am I hearing from them? Well, one thing that I'm hearing is that at the moment, there are no cruise ships that are allowed to sail out of American ports, which is a very smart thing. But I am hearing that some of the cruise ships that ordinarily do Caribbean itineraries are planning to change the lineup of ports so that there's a lot more sailing and a lot less stopping in ports, so they aren't disgorging 3,000 or 4,000 people onto a small island. Instead, they will be using their own private islands. So many cruise lines have private islands, which have no people living on them, but they have facilities on them. So there's a beach club, and there's a giant wave pool maybe, and there's maybe giant slides and zip lines and all that kind of thing. So that way, the passengers on the ships would not be coming into contact with people that they haven't already been in contact with.
Right.
And all the food service and so on would be handled by ship staff. So this is the hope from the cruise lines I'm hearing from. The hope is that just as cruise lines were being characterized as giant floating petri dishes at the beginning of the pandemic, if they are able to come up with really stringent health and safety practices and sanitization practices, their goal is to become the safest place to travel. And I think that could be possible because you would be in a completely sanitized environment, and the only time you got off the ship, you would be in an equally sanitized environment. So I think that may be the beginning of a return to cruising, at least in the Caribbean. I know that some of the river cruise companies are actually doing quite well with bookings. And I know that some are saying that they're almost booked solid for 2021 and are already booking into 2022.
Wow.
So, and there's a reason for that. Cruise aficionados are passionate about cruising. And it's not unusual to be on a ship and you meet someone over dinner and you ask, oh, is this your first cruise? And they say, actually, this is my 25th cruise on this cruise line.
Mm-hmm.
There's great loyalty in the cruise world. And I know that there are people who are just chomping at the bit, waiting to get back on a ship. Saying the one thing I've not been missing, Jim, is airline food.
Right. I have not missed when I'm in my seat in a plane and someone has mistaken their seat on their ticket. It says 18A, but they're at 22D, and they can't differentiate between the number 18 and the number 22, and they just seem really confused. I don't miss that. I feel like there's a special type of person who can't read a number. And
I was on a flight once. I was on a flight once on Air Jamaica, and I got to my seat. And there was a very lovely, very stubborn, elderly Jamaican lady sitting in my seat.
Right.
And I said, I am so sorry, but I think there's been a mistake. And I showed her my ticket, and she looked at it and she said, you go and sit somewhere else.
Right.
And I said, well, I would be happy to do that. In fact, I would be happy to sit in your seat. I don't really care.
Right.
But where would that seat be? And she said, I don't know. You just go and sit somewhere else.
Right.
So I called the flight attendant over and I said, I'm not trying to make trouble. I really don't mind, but where should I sit? And she said, I guarantee you that lady flies with us regularly and she will never give up your seat now that she's in it. So do as she says, just go sit somewhere else. And if that person shows up, we'll sort it out.
Unbelievable. Oh my God. Come on.
I don't know. My goal is to get to be that old.
Right.
And that stubborn that I can sit in any seat I want on a plane and people will just let me. That's my goal.
It would just be Liz being Liz at that point, right?
That'd be my plan.
You can't fight it, so you might as well just go with it. Oh
Exactly.
my God.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of air travel, we've seen articles, about airlines taking out the middle seat, putting in, plexiglass between seats. We've even seen, I think it's Canadian Airlines that have ended social distancing altogether on flights. With so much, anxiety and confusion that surrounds airlines and protocols. There was an article today, September 16th, about international flights coming in and people kind of coming here with the virus from all over the world. Are airlines doing enough, in your opinion, to reassure the apprehensive public that it's safe to fly?
No, I don't think so. Certainly, at the best of times, I don't like to sit side by side with someone. I am so happy if I'm in a seat where the middle, I never choose a middle seat, obviously.
Right. Who does?
Who does? But I'm so delighted if I get into my aisle or my window seat and there's nobody beside me, because I'm sure you've had this experience. I have caught colds.
Oh, yeah.
I've caught the flu. I've been perfectly healthy when I got on the plane and then sick when I got off. So at the moment, I don't feel confident about flying. And I hate to say that because God knows I'm a travel journalist and I have a radio show that's about travel. But I have to be honest and say I would not get on a plane right now. Not until there's a vaccine. In fact, I was invited on a trip that I could be on right this minute. Mm-hmm. And I love all the people who are on the trip. Makes it even harder.
Right.
But to get there, it meant I had to go on a train from St. Catharines to Quebec City and then get in a van, the kind of van that we use for press trips, mm-hmm. and go another more than 200 kilometers north.
Right.
And I was so tempted because, as I said, I love all the people on that trip and I would have loved to have gone to that destination. But I talked it over with my husband and my 2 adult sons, and they all said, "Are you out of your mind?"
Right.
And I decided to pass on it until I feel more confident, because on trains, they are now trying very hard not to seat you next to other passengers, mm-hmm. but they do have a disclaimer that says in their busy corridor, and guess what? That's the busy corridor. That's where I would have been.
Mm-hmm.
They may have to seat you next to
Right.
someone, and I'm not comfortable with that right now. If you leave the province and you come back, like right now, the truth is Canadians, if they want to, they can hop on a plane and fly to Florida.
Right.
But eventually you have to come home. And when you come home, you have to self-isolate for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And some of the destinations that you might go to might make you self-isolate for 2 weeks. For example, my one son lives in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
and the state of Massachusetts requires a 2-week period of self-isolation. So if I go to visit him, and I may do this anyway just because I miss him, but if I drive down to Boston and my husband and I, and we see him for 2 weeks, we'll be in isolation for the 2 weeks. And then when we come back home, we'll be in isolation again for 2 weeks. So that's a month of lockdown.
Right.
So,
And check-ins, because the government will check in, and then they'll
they
find
do.
you. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Actually, a friend of mine who has a cottage at Shirkston Shores, I don't
Mm-hmm.
know
Mm-hmm.
if you've ever been there. It's really
Yep.
lovely.
Yep.
He has a friend there who is an American. And I'm not sure whether this guy has dual citizenship or what the score is, but somehow this guy was able to cross the border. And he was asked if he was planning to self-isolate for 2 weeks. And he said, oh, yes, I am. I will. But he didn't. And they have golf carts there. And so neighbors saw him zooming around
Oh my God.
in the golf cart.
Right.
And some of those neighbors were nervous and fearful for their own health, and they reported him.
Of course.
So
Yeah.
a government official showed up at his cottage and said, hey, I think you're supposed to be self-isolating. We're going to give you one more chance, but if we catch you off your premises again anytime in the next 2 weeks, the fine was going to be significant. And I don't mean a few $100s. I mean many thousands of dollars. So he's being a good boy now and staying inside his cottage.
I'm amazed that they let that slide to begin with when you have proof.
Yeah.
When you have evidence. I mean, damage done already.
Yeah.
What one more chance? What's the one more chance about? You've already I'm sorry, I brought my car into this mechanic. If he screws up one more time and if I can't drive this car, I'm not going to him again, or I'm not going to her again.
If the brakes fail one more time.
Unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
Well, here's another loaded question. What lessons from your travels and your line of work have taught you over the years that you've applied, in your daily life?
Okay, that's a great question. So I would say the one thing that I have really learned is that I'm a very proud Canadian. You won't find anyone who is happier to be Canadian than I am. But one thing I have learned from my travels is that while we do things very well in Canada on the whole, we don't have all the answers. And if you look around when you're traveling, you may see things being done differently in another country, and you may think, oh, that's not how we do it at home, but that's a great idea. So I try to remember when I'm traveling that I should be open to all the new ideas that I see while still being very grateful to be Canadian. And so I will often bring home things that I've found, and sometimes they're physical things. I may find a kind of food that I've never had before in Canada. I'll bring it home, and then sadly I get hooked on it, and then, oh dear, how am I going to get more?
Right.
But sometimes I find a food that I can get in Canada, but I've just never had it before. So a great example is the first time I was in Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. We had a guide who was really nice, and she said to me, have you ever had pannekuchen? Mm-hmm. And I said, no. And she said, then you need to go to, and she told us this restaurant. So we went. And pannekuchen is kind of like a cross between a ham and cheese sandwich and a pancake. And it has a kind of sauce on top that looks like maple syrup, kind of tastes like molasses, but is better than either
Right.
mixed.
Right.
And so I fell in love with pannekuchen and had it a million times while I was in Holland. And then I came home and thought, oh no, how do I feed my pannekuchen habit? And I remembered that there was a Dutch shop in Niagara. So I went there, and wouldn't you know it, they sell pannekuchen mix.
Right. Yes.
And it was with instructions that I could not read. But
Right.
that's okay, because I have Google Translate.
Right.
And so I brought it home and I figured out how to make them. So I guess that would be what I've learned from my travels, is that while Canada is a wonderful place and I'm endlessly grateful to be Canadian, we don't necessarily do everything right. We don't necessarily have all the answers. And if I look around while I'm traveling, I might just learn something.
Right. Goes to my next question. Why do you travel?
Well, there are many answers to that. I guess I am insatiably curious. And I think you know me well enough to know that I love a party.
Yep.
And I love to have fun. And so travel is always an opportunity to find a new party and to have fun, to meet new people. On a more practical level, I travel because I get paid to edit magazines and to write travel stories, and now to do a radio show. So I need content.
Right.
And writing is what I do most easily and most naturally. So writing about travel just is the perfect solution for me to be able to have that fun and those adventures, and then to be able to write about it.
Right. Yeah.
Why do you travel?
Oh, I travel for a myriad of reasons. It's everything from curiosity to fundamentally, for me, it's about the people. It's always about the people. And be it a chef or be it a small business owner. For example, in Copenhagen in December, I was hooked with the tourism board, and we got to do a food tour with this lovely young woman. Her name's Cindy, and we've been keeping in touch. And she's also a food tour guide. She's a mom, and so it's fundamentally about the people. And for me, it's about also the food. It's what unifies us. Common experiences that if we just look beyond, and I know this sounds very dreamy, but if we look beyond a skin color or a creed or a faith, there's so much more in common than there are differences. And so for me, it's chasing that commonality, but it's ultimately learning more about the person behind, be it a business, be it an apron, or be it a desk. It's people.
Sure.
And it's experiences fundamentally.
You're absolutely right. And that, I think, is one of the great things about travel, is that, you and I go on press trips. And for your listeners who don't know about press trips, they typically last somewhere between 4 and maybe 7 days. And you meet a ton of fascinating, wonderful people, but then you leave them behind. So you miss them, but luckily, through the magic of social media, it's a rare day that I don't get a message from somebody in Jordan or somebody in Germany or somebody in France or whatever. You make friends and you keep those friends and you stay in touch with them, and you know what's going on in their lives and in their countries and with their families and so on. And I love that.
Yeah.
That's something about travel that I really love.
It's priceless. It's priceless. But you also host, and we've mentioned this before, a show on iHeartRADIO. It's called Liz Fleming Travels. Tell people what that is all about and why people should be listening to that program.
Well, they should be listening to it, because what else will they be doing while they're drinking their coffee at 11:30 on a Saturday morning?
Right.
Um, so,
Perfect time. Perfect
so
time. Yeah.
Liz Fleming Travels is it's kind of whatever I want it to be, which is I feel incredibly fortunate to be able to say that. But my goal at the moment is to help people to think about travel on a number of different levels. The most important level, I think, is what people can do now. So I'm always looking for the possible trips that people can do now. So I'm based in Niagara, and so I'm looking principally at the moment at trips that you can do in Ontario and in Quebec.
Mhm.
So I'm fortunate that I have a number of friends who are brilliant, who work in the travel industry, like you.
Oh, come on.
And I have been interviewing friends of mine who are able to offer insights. So, for example, I interviewed Deneen Perrin,
Mhm.
who is in charge of public relations for the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. And she was able to talk generally about what hotels are doing to keep guests safe, and specifically what her hotel is doing. This past week, I interviewed a fellow travel journalist, Laura Byrne-Paquette, who has an online site called Ottawa Road Trips.
Mhm.
And she's kind of the go-to site if you're planning a trip in the Ottawa area.
Mhm.
So I had her talk about what's going on in Ottawa right now. I've talked to people from the Niagara Parks Commission about their sites and how they're keeping people safe, and also how they're offering special deals. This is really nice. They
Mhm.
have Thankful Thursdays, and if you happen to be a frontline worker, healthcare worker, you get 2-for-1 tickets,
Cool.
which is really nice.
Mhm.
So I do that kind of thing. Then I look at travel from an aspirational standpoint. So my sponsor is CAA Travel,
Mhm.
and I've taken a cue from them because their ad is "Dream now, travel later." So while we may not be able to go to all the places we'd like to right now, we can certainly think about them,
Sure.
and we can plan for the future. And then I do straight up travel tips. Uh, so trips for road tripping, tips
Mhm.
for if you're going on your first RV trip, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So there are 3 segments. They're all 3 of them are different each week, and I'm having a ton of fun.
Sure.
So I would really love it if people could tune in. If you're
Absolutely.
busy at 11:30 on Saturday morning, I can't imagine what you could be doing that would be more exciting than listening to my show. But if that's the case, you can go online at 610 CKTB, and there are recordings of all the shows. So you
Right.
can listen to them whenever.
Perfect. Maybe you listen to them as you plan the trip, and then when you're actually on the trip, you're actually listening to the rest of it as entertainment as you're traveling.
What a good idea.
This is what I do, Liz Fleming. I come up with ideas, right?
And you're brilliant.
Uh, I got a rapid fire segment for you, Liz Fleming. 10 questions. You ready for this?
Okay.
Number 1, what destination are you reminiscing most about lately?
The Galapagos Islands.
Oh, come on. I thought you were going to say Pickering.
I loved it. Yep.
Whale watching off Newfoundland or chasing northern lights in the Yukon? What do you prefer?
Whale watching, because I love Newfoundland. I love the Northern Lights, and I love the Yukon too, but yeah.
Yeah.
Newfoundland.
Beach bum holiday or hiking Machu Picchu?
Hiking Machu Picchu.
Sake or Sambuca?
Neither. I'm allergic to alcohol.
Oh, wow. Okay. Uh, what would be a good alternative versus alternative?
What would be a good alternative versus alternative?
Yeah. So instead of sake versus Sambuca, would it be
Ah,
like
how about,
green tea versus?
well, let's see. I really like root beer floats.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. That's totally amazing.
If I was going to have a treat, like I don't drink a lot of pop, but if I was going to, I would have a root beer float.
Nice. Is there a destination that speaks to you on a culinary level?
Mm, let me see. Well, some of the best food I've ever had would have been in Guadeloupe. And
Okay.
the reason for that is because they have access to such great seafood.
Hmm.
But in addition, Guadeloupe is a part of France.
Hmm.
So a lot of Parisian chefs take a year off and run away to the beach, and they end up in Guadeloupe. So there are some of the most fantastic restaurants there.
That
So yeah,
sounds terrible.
it's awful.
Terrible stuff. Most inspirational trip you've taken?
Mm. Um, well, if I hadn't already said Galapagos Islands,
Right.
I would have said that. But I'm going to say the Canadian Arctic. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I flew up to Pond Inlet. And from Pond Inlet, I went 7 hours north on a skidoo on the ice. And we camped on the ice at the floe edge. And
Wow.
every day we would go to the floe edge and we would swim with beluga whales, or we would kayak with bowhead whales and walruses and seals. And closely tied to that would be 10 days I spent in the Torngat Mountains in Labrador. And again, whales, polar bears, black bears. And what was wonderful about the Torngats trip was that the camp that I stayed at, and all of our guides and everyone, with the exception of a few people from Parks Canada and the other journalists, everyone there was Inuit. And
Mm-hmm.
so I made some really good Inuit friends who are still friends of mine. And I learned a lot about their culture. We were so fortunate on that trip. There was a woman there who is the most renowned throat singer
Wow.
in Canada, and she had her partner with her, and the two of them taught us all to do throat singing. And we also learned drum dancing.
Oh,
And it wasn't like you go to a travel show and there's a 5-minute demonstration.
right.
We
Right.
spent days learning how to throat sing and how to drum dance. And we learned about why it's done. And we learned so much about the Inuit people and how they live their lives. And it completely changed my perspective on Aboriginal rights and how we should live together in Canada. And so, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So those
Wow.
would be my two.
Describe your travel style in 3 words.
Hmm. Um, Inquisitive, fun loving. I'm cheating because that's a hyphenated, that's 2 words hyphenated, but fun loving. And I'm going to cheat again. As much as possible, free form. When
Freeform.
I'm planning the trip, I like to leave things pretty loosey goosey, because who knows what I'm going to find down at the end of that road, and who I might meet, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Dead or alive, who would you love to sit next to on a long haul flight?
Hmm. Okay, the first name that pops into my mind. Peter Zosky.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Any reason why?
Yes, because Peter Zosky, for me, for many, many years when I was growing up and when I was in my early days as a mom and at home with my kids, he was the voice of Canada for me.
Hmm.
And he had a magical ability to find exactly the right person to interview in every part of Canada. And so, he might be talking to a fisherman off the coast of Newfoundland, and then maybe he'd be talking to someone who carves totem poles in Haida Gwaii, and he might be talking to a figure skater. He might be talking to an artist. He's had a way of putting his finger on the pulse of every part of Canada. And this is a nice story. I went to Trent, and Peter was the chancellor at Trent for quite a while. But before that, I had to write a piece for the Trent magazine because I was the editor of the Trent magazine. And I was writing about heroes and how Canadians treat heroes very differently than Americans. And that for us, our big heroes are people like Terry Fox and Rick Hansen and people like that. And I said, for me, one of my big heroes was Peter Zosky. Now, at that point, he wasn't the chancellor. He was just someone I listened to on the radio. But I talked about him, as I just have, and how important I think he was to the Canadian culture.
Mm-hmm.
So he was alive at the time, and I sent what I wrote to his secretary at CBC, but I never knew whether he got it or not. So many years later, after he'd been chancellor at Trent and he died, his life partner contacted me and asked if it would be okay to publish that piece in a memorial book that they were putting together about him. And so I was so thrilled because that meant that he'd read it and he knew that he was my hero. So
wow,
so that's a little story about that.
that's a little story.
That's a little story.
Wow.
A little story.
Well, let's end on a really strong note. My last question for you: where do you feel your soul lives?
Wherever my kids are.
Oh, that's lovely.
But that's true. But I would say a part of my soul will always be on the St. Lawrence River in the Thousand Islands, because that's where I was raised. My family has a cottage there, and I've gone there every summer of my life. And I took my children there, and my brothers and sisters are there. And so, yes. So my soul is truly wherever my kids are, but if they were in the Thousand Islands, that would be good too.
Liz Fleming, catch her on iHeartRadio, her show Liz Fleming Travels, weekly every Saturday morning. You have nothing else better to do, honestly, people, than to tune in to Liz Fleming Travels on iHeartRadio. Liz Fleming, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today on my podcast, and I wish you and everyone in your circle continued health and happiness, and hopefully sooner than later we can catch up in person.
Thanks so much, Jim. It was great to talk to you today.